Hello, guys and gals, and welcome. So we have another update from Moonbeast, which is one of the games that's being created by the original Diablo II developers. Um, Also the same ones that created things like Torchlight and whatnot. This one is Trade versus Solo Self-Found, and this is, number 6? Hello again. The full title of this post should be Trade versus Solo Self-Found. Why not both, but not in the way that you think? Sometimes less is more. Pretty big title. Some players are merchant princes, creating entire empires on trade. Others are dark wanderers subsisting off of only what they find themselves in the field. Most people probably lie somewhere in between, freely trading with their mates, but occasionally dipping their toes into the ocean of the open market. Just like players in ARPGs seem to have a unique and differing approaches to trade, you get single-player ARPGs where everyone is solo self-found by necessity. Games like Diablo IV, which as far as I can see, wishes it were solo self-found, holding its nose at the concept of trade as if it were necessary, but highly distasteful custom that needs to be relegated to behind that extra smelly dumpster in the back alley. Games like Path of Exile, which posits that while trade is a fundamental pillar of the game, there also shouldn't even be a clear trade currency, and everyone ought to be bartering two splackjack globes and one boobob crod for 14 loose splots dolls, doilies, and 3 vish ishcocks, and one hobnob cob, or whatever the current exchange rates are. And games like Last Epic, which evidently plans on splitting characters into trade slash not trade binaries to satisfy their community, which seems to exist on a wide spectrum with respect to trade, just like the ARPG community at large. So if you're here reading this, you probably have an opinion on trade. I do. I think open trade is important. What you want to know is what our opinion on it is, and is that compatible with yours? Actually, I think I already answered that question earlier, maybe not directly, so I'll spell it out a bit more. Starting, as always, with a set of design tenets, the ability to trade relatively freely is important for a community in a game that's fundamentally about loot. It's absolutely true. The possibility of trade hugely expands the pool of exciting drops. Absolutely true. This is something that a lot of people don't realize, is that if you make something extraordinarily rare, but you make it so that it can be traded, then the extraordinarily rare becomes less rare, because someone will always find it, and that someone will not always need it, and they will trade it off to someone who does. So, for instance, if somebody ends up finding themselves I don't know, ethereal flesh or fang knife in Diablo II, they might not necessarily want it nor have any intention of using it. But I would, and I'd trade them something else for it. Having the ability to trade expands the pool of drops, not decreases it. Itemization first, then trade. If the itemization is bad, you might as well not bother. I mean, this is also true. If the items aren't worth trading, then nobody's going to want to trade for them. Drop rates need to be tuned primarily for solo self-found. So this is, I'm not really 100% sure I agree with this one, but I mean, basically what this comes down to is that if you have a game that's based off of the drop chances for if everyone can trade, then you're going to make things more rare than less rare. However, when you balance the game based on solo self-found, things become less rare, not more rare, because obviously you want the items to actually fall for the player when they're playing the game. For instance, if you have an item that's so ridiculously rare that a person could play through the game 10 times and never find it, um, it would still potentially drop within this, which is the ability to trade with other players. But the problem is that your individual player, your single player, will never see it. So it does make a problem where you have to actually tune the drops for the solo self-found players. I'm not interested, at least in the core game, in solutions where players who choose not to trade get better items. Last epoch. I think that's a trap that will only leave the solo self side happy, or people who figure out how to exploit it anyway. Hmm. Trade should be relatively smooth. A simple trade currency is a good thing, and I believe the linear hierarchy of currency runes is better than a singular one, Soj or P-gems. That he's talking specifically about Diablo here, because obviously in the beginning it was P-gems, and then it was also Sojas. And then when Sojas essentially got destroyed because, well, they were all duped and they figured out a way to remove them as currency. Eventually went back to P-gems and then also runes, which kind of like P-gems are basically like change, like pennies, and runes are more like dollars, or a network of PoE. Let's see here. Is it better than a singular one like Soldier P-gems or a network PoE? Trading can promote the social aspect of the game, but it's far from the primary social driver. There's no need to add friction to trading to try and prop it up as such. Hmm. Hmm. Bind on drop, pick up, and equip, whether to the character or the count, is appropriate in narrow cases. I agree with this. I think that bind on drop, bind on pick up, and bind on equip can be useful in certain situations where you have an item that you don't want traded. Like maybe you have something that's a specific item that drops to specific characters. But at the grand scheme of things, when it comes to bind on pickup, bind on drop, and bind on equip, you generally just don't want to use them in the video games on a broad scale. Like, for instance, in Diablo 4, as an example, I don't think legendary items should be bound. The legendary items should definitely not be bound. And then on the same case, when it comes to unique items, I think some unique items would be okay to be bound, and this would be one of those narrow cases. But honestly, I think the unique items probably shouldn't be bound either. Even then, except in a small number of very special cases, we should provide ways for players to unbind items with appropriate resource cost. That's an interesting idea, the ability to unbind an item. PvP and other competitive game modes amplifies the robustness of the trade economy. Yes. PvP has always been a driving force. It's a lot like how they say in the real world that war always bolsters the economy, because during war everybody has a job, you have a purpose, right? Even places like the car factories were turned into tank factories and so forth and so on. There was always something to do, there was always something that needed to be made, something that needed to be created, food that needed to be cooked, and innovations that needed to be done, right? And so PvP is very much like war in that regard, because you literally are in competition with someone else, and so you're constantly trying to achieve something that the other player can't. Perfect items, a specific build, whatever it may be. And PvP, as well as other competitive game modes, definitely do amplify the robustness of a trade economy. In fact, when a game doesn't have good PvP, it's more often a death knell to the game, because then you lose out on all of that generation, all of that community that the PvP generates. Rampant botting can destroy the economy. We have seen this in Diablo II. Once the botting got to a certain state, the entire economy was essentially destroyed. If you haven't played Diablo II LOD like recently, actually I don't even know recently, because I think Diablo II Resurrected has kind of really killed the community over there, because Diablo 2 Resurrected is great. But before Diablo 2 Resurrected came out, the entire economy was destroyed on Diablo 2 LOD. It was awful. It basically got to the point where nothing was worth anything unless it was perfect. It had to be literally a perfect item. And I'm talking about like Harlequin Crest Shakos that aren't perfect defense sold to the NPC because they weren't perfect defense. Yeah. But to remove the economy to combat botting is, to put it mildly, ass forward, aka backwards. And this is something that I've always stated as well. As bad as bots are, as terrible as they can be, and as good as they can ruin economies, I mean, as they can do it quite effectively, you cannot remove your economy to combat botting. That's just like shooting yourself in the foot. Um, Going with these bind on pickup craps, going with these bind on drops, bind on equips for everything, basically making it so that nobody can trade anything with anyone else. All you're basically doing is removing a major part of your game for what exactly? You removed a major part of your game to try and destroy the bots, and you didn't even succeed. That's the crazy thing, is that doing this and completely eliminating trade actually doesn't completely ruin the bots. They just move to other avenues of creating revenue, like selling the in-game currency, gold, power leveling characters, leveling up accounts and selling the entire accounts. There are tons of ways that they can still make money, even in a game that has absolutely no trade. So you're not fixing the issue, you're just making the game suck for basically no reason. Given all that, I think our approach is pretty evident. Our itemization is a continuation of the concepts we created for Diablo II. This includes stuff like non-class biased drops, extended by some new concepts that I've alluded to before, runes as currency, a large pool of interesting named unique items that are obtainable solo, target farming, value across all item tiers, and support for PvP, etc. Trade is relatively easy, but this time we'll add a two-stage confirmation. Am I the only one that finds it shocking that RuneScape has had that for over a decade, but no a major ARPG does? Two-stage confirmation. 4. The fact that this game isn't intended to be free-to-play inherently impacts botting versus, say, Lost Ark. I think this is actually a pretty big thing. You cannot make a free-to-play game that has a trade economy. Because the issue here is that a free-to-play game that has a trade economy allows for the bots to create an infinite number of accounts, which they can then use to bot an infinite number of times with very limited barrier to entry. And unfortunately, a lot of botting is really about barrier to entry. If botting is easy, if you make it ridiculously easy, like you literally hand them the keys to your car, then yes, they're going to be able to do absolutely crazy things. Free to play, unfortunately, is the definition of this. You basically enable the bots to essentially make as many accounts as they possibly want. A similar situation to this was seen in Counter-Strike Global Offensive, when they made Counter-Strike Global Offensive a free-to-play game, and the number of cheaters in Counter-Strike Global Offensive skyrocketed after that. The reason is because if you identify a cheater in a game that is pay-to-play, then the cheater then has to buy a new account, okay? They can't just hop right back in. They could have to buy a new account. There's a barrier to entry. How many times are they willing to buy a new account? How many times are they willing to get banned? And how much money are they willing to spend before they finally decide, hey, enough is enough, right? Well, when you have a free-to-play game, I can just make a new account. I can just set up a new email, make a new account, put a fake name in. It don't really matter. I can make as many accounts as I want to. And making the game free to play, unfortunately, has a huge impact on the botting in general. When you have a barrier to entry, you make things more difficult. Whether it's a price to pay for the game, whether, there's 100 different ways that you can add barriers to entries to video games. Maybe it's something along the lines of making currency more difficult to obtain. In Diablo II, one of the craziest things that we've talked about before is that bots are often very stupid and don't really know how to behave outside of their programming. And if you made things a little bit more random, a little bit more unpredictable, it would be next to impossible for the bots to program around it. Like, say, for instance, instead of teleporting in a straight line, let's say that the teleport was a little bit more random, or there was a big delay on it, say of like 2 seconds in between teleports. The bots would die horribly. Also, teleport itself makes botting extremely easy in Diablo 2 because it's much more difficult to program a bot to fight a unknown variable of monsters in between destination A and B. Teleport makes it much easier because you can just skip over all the monsters between A and B and go straight for the monsters that are static. And that way, when you're programming only for a monster that's always going to be there. For instance, if you program for Pindle, Pindle is always in the same spot. Yes, his modifiers change a little bit, but the variables are very static. However, if you were to program to, say, go to Bale, the monsters in between Bale and the waypoint are varying and completely different. Sometimes it's zombies, sometimes it's gloams, sometimes it's defilers, sometimes it's there's literally almost like 100 different combinations of monsters in between the two destinations, right? So it's very difficult to have the bot program for every single variable along that path, and it also would take them a lot longer without the teleport. The thing that he's hitting on here is that free to play inherently impacts botting because it makes the entire process easier for the bots. It lowers the barrier of entry and it makes the entire process way too easy. One of the easiest ways to fight botting is to make the process more difficult. The more difficult that you make the process of botting, in other words, the bigger the barrier of entry, the less the botters are going to be interested in trying to set things up like that, and the harder it becomes. For instance, in Diablo II, Lord of Destruction, the barrier to entry was so low that you would often have people running like 8 bots on one computer, right? It's not quite as easy to do that in Diablo 2 Resurrected because the game is more, robust graphically. Although there are ways that you can pretty much bring the graphics to a bare minimum and also run multiple copies of Diablo 2 Resurrected on your computer. But the difference is that Diablo 2 LLD could be running multiple copies. I mean, you could probably, I don't even know what the limit is on D2 LOD, but the minimum, it has such a minimum requirements that just about any computer in the market can run it multiple times easily. Diablo 2 Resurrected is more than that, and so it has a higher barrier to entry. And that's really what this entire comment comes down to, and I know I've kind of gone off on a tangent, but it's important to combat botting with barrier to entry. And the more difficult you can make it, the better. In addition, the core game design, especially the concept of shards, which we talked about in the last video, by the way, totally reconfigures the landscape. Markets become much more local. In a personal shard, it's solo self-found by necessity, unless you're mad, I suppose. In a private shard, you only trade with others on that shard, be it your friends, guildmates, or whatever. Taking items from shard to shard is subject to restrictions imposed by the administrators of those shards. All this further helps to reduce the impact of botting while also giving players tools to combat botting themselves. The gameplay itself, which combines highly granular procedural levels with elevation, mutable and interactive environments, and a map-wide strategic elements, all work against the bots. Lastly, who remembers player-owned vendors from Ultima Online? So much fun. It's kind of interesting what he's talking about here with shards, because obviously so in the previous, he talked about world shards, which is basically the ability to have kind of like your own a world, and in that world you can control the variables, like what it's set up for. Is it hardcore? Is it solo self-found, etc.? And of course, you could also choose what players would be able to bring items into your world. And it would almost seem like this would be a very effective way to combat bots because, well, the bots would have to be able to transfer their items to your shard. And depending on how many shards there are and what the rules are set up, it could potentially make transferring items between shards next to impossible, or just difficult enough that would combat bots pretty well. I'm not exactly 100% sure on this, but it does sound kind of an interesting idea there. And I would assume that would also mean there would be entire worlds comprised of nothing but bots, which would be kind of hilarious. But how would they be able to take those items off of that world, comprised entirely of bots, to other worlds if there are restrictions imposed by the administrators of the other worlds, basically preventing those bots from being able to move the items off of their shard? It's kind of an interesting idea. I mean, all of this is rather interesting, and I think the really cool thing about a lot of this is that it really comes down to the fact that he's got it like dead on. The ability to trade relatively freely is important for a community in a game that's fundamentally about loot. I think he hits it on the head right here. This is like one of the most important things. And then the other thing that he hits right on the head is the fact that you can't really take it away without shooting yourself in the foot. I mean, it's where did he have that at? So, rampant botting can destroy the economy. But to remove the economy to combat botting is, to put it mildly, ass forward, aka backwards. The entire thing here is that he has recognized the two greatest things about trade in video games. Number one, that trade is absolutely important for the community of the game. And number two, that removing trade to combat botting is one of the worst ways that you can combat botting, par none. It doesn't combat botting because the bots still exist, and you'll find bots in video games no matter what. But the thing is that by destroying the economy, by removing the economy from the game, you also remove the community. The community essentially starts to die because there's no trading. Diablo 3 is a really big example of this. There's basically no trading in Diablo 3 whatsoever. And because of this, the game feels very single player. There's no feeling of community within Diablo 3. It just feels like a single player adventure. Even when you're playing with other people, it still feels like a single player adventure. There's only one way that you can potentially share items with other players, and it doesn't work within ladder in Diablo 3. The only way that you can potentially share an item in Diablo 3 is if you're playing with the person and the item drops and you're not on ladder. So if you're on the Eternal Realm and an item falls and you're both standing there, you can share it back and forth between those two characters. But other than that, there's literally no other way to share items in Diablo 3. And it's really quite sad. The trading thing was a knee-jerk reaction because Diablo 3 wasn't always like that. And basically what happened is exactly this. They removed the economy to combat the botting, the all the trading and everything that was going on. It was a knee-jerk reaction to the failure of the auction house. There was a whole lot going on in the beginning of Diablo 3, and they decided that they were just going to go the complete other end of the spectrum and just remove everything to make it better, right? Well, it didn't make it better. It made it into a single-player adventure. Now, the other side of this argument is solo self-found. And solo self-found is something that I've been enjoying lately. It's a very interesting game mode, especially when you become very adept at the game. If you've never done a solo self-found run, I would highly recommend it. Solo self-found runs basically require you to utilize what you're given and not necessarily what you can obtain via trading. Like I was talking about earlier, there are certain items in the game that you may never obtain unless you can trade for them, right? And this goes back to his point earlier on the possibility of trade hugely expands the pool of exciting drops, right? Because you don't necessarily have to find it, but somebody else can find it, right? Well, in solo self-found, your gear is pretty pathetic, let me just say. But having pathetic equipment actually makes the game more difficult and more challenging on the whole, and can make some very interesting gameplay on its own. I have several solo self-found runs up for Diablo II already. I believe I'm only one shy of doing every class. I need to do the Assassin next, and I'm currently working on the Amazon. But in general, when it comes to solo self-found, it's a very fun game mode. However, solo self-found is very much so a mode that does not work in an online community. It's something that really, in my opinion, personally just belongs in single player. Solo self-found is more of a single player thing than it is an online multiplayer thing. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this update. This is one of the updates of Moonbeast's development process, and I'm actually really interested in learning about this stuff because every time he puts out a post, there's always some pretty good information in here about game development. As always, thanks for watching, and keep watching.